Today, I'm going to expound on something that I had talked about in an earlier video today. Now, it is based upon, of course, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. So he says simply this. He says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every type of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, even as Christ God has forgiven you." So here is Paul with a very simple exhortation today. You see, I'm going to give you a couple of very quick scenarios that maybe you are familiar with. Now, let's say, for example, and this is probably where most of these particular situations happen. Let's say you have a spouse, okay? You are involved in a romantic relationship. And you have basically put all your eggs in a basket, okay? You've said that this is the person that I want to be not only romantically involved in, but to actually spend a lifetime with. So you've made a decision. You've made the decision that you're going to overlook the obvious faults and failures that this particular person has, and you're going to adjust to a brand new monogamous relationship with this person. And so you enter into this contract, and that's what it is. A marriage is a contract. It's a contract between you, this person, the witnesses that were there, the officiant, and also society and the Lord Himself. So you've said, I am going to honor this contract as long as we both shall live. Well, we all know that when you get involved in an interpersonal relationship, there is always the possibility, of course, of conflict. And I love how Jordan Peterson puts it. He said simply this: when you are discussing something with someone that is very important, the chance of actually not being offended, or maybe I should say, not having a colorful discussion, is absolutely zero, because both of you are coming from a totally different perspective. You're looking at things differently. I mean, let's face it. When you have two people coming together, usually they come from different backgrounds. They have different personalities. They have grown up in different environments. They've had different types of parents. They, both have strong opinions and certain ideas that they have developed over their lifetime. They've had certain environments. They've had certain educational advantages or disadvantages, depending on the point of view. And you're coming together and you're trying to mold and you're trying to navigate, coming together. And I want to tell you something. It's a life learning experience. It is something that you're going to be doing every day. You might say that each one of you, I know they say that men are rather simple, but we're really not that simple. And we always say that the woman is a mystery. Well, that is true. And so what you have here is you have two personalities trying to mold together. Now, what can happen in a relationship, and usually the first place that it breaks down is in communication. Because when you are having, an argument, or let's say a powerful discussion, the chance, as I said before, is, of course, that the chance of not having a strong opinion with someone else and not being offended is actually zero. Now, usually in a relationship, you have someone who has very strong personality, and then you also have someone who has a more of a kind and caring disposition. Now, it could be the man, it could be the woman. Usually it's the lady, okay? But not always, okay? So that's important. So you have one person trying to put their strong position on the other one. Maybe you can even use the term assert their will. And so if you have someone who is, let's say, a more gentle personality, what are they going to do? They're going to back down. But then sooner or later, after this strong personality continues to exert their influence, sooner or later, the person with the more gentle disposition is going to explode. And you're going to wonder just what happened. Well, the simple fact is you kept on trying to exert your control. And there's always that individual who says, you're trying to control me. And the truth of the matter is you are. And so you haven't learned to negotiate. And in some situations, there is no negotiation, especially if you have an abuser or you have someone who is trying to exert their dominance over an individual. Sooner or later, that person is going to rebel. That person is going to say, I'm not taking this anymore. And usually what it means is that they're going to cut off the relationship. So it's very, very important that when you are in an interpersonal relationship, you need to follow a very simple format. And that simple format is found in James 1:19. It says simply this: be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. If you want to have good communication, you've got to understand that communication is 80% the ability to be able to listen. That is so absolutely vital when it comes to interpersonal relationships. You've got to work on your skills at listening. If you are able to listen, you are going to be able to dissipate and you're going to be able to bring down these colorful discussions that you can have with your spouse. And also as well, measure what you say. The important thing is to recognize that you are, do you value this person that you are talking to? If you don't value the person, then you're going to try to bully them. You're going to try and intimidate them. You're going to try to manipulate them. And I want to tell you this right now. The breakdown is often because you don't value your partner. Now, when you first started off, you valued them. You thought that they were important. You thought that they were the, cat's meow, the whatever you want to call them. But then as time progresses, and you have to be careful about this, is the fact that their faults and their failures and their personality can get in the way. They have the classic joke of, well, don't squeeze the toothpaste in the middle or something like that. Or he snores or whatever it is that annoys you. And it can annoy you. And that's when you have to make certain decisions and certain choices and certain ideas. Yes, can I get along with this particular trait, with this particular habit, with this particular outlook? Can I do that? Or do I have to, make that known? Now, this is a very important point when it comes to relationships in a monogamous relationship, a marriage. What you need to do is you got to make a decision that you are going to allow your spouse to hold you accountable. And if you're not willing to do that, then your relationship is doomed to failure, because that's why the Lord brought them in your life. They have strengths that you don't have, as you have strengths that they don't have. And it's a mixing together of that relationship that is going to make it work or make it fail. And when you realize that you give your spouse the ability to speak into your life, they are your accountability partner. You have to be willing to say, you know what? I may be wrong on this situation, because they see something that you do not see. Let's be very honest, okay? We all have a certain picture of ourselves. We have this personal view we think we are such and such a way, and in some ways we are, but in other ways we are not, because we, of course, have our own perspective. So it's important that we, when we are involved in this relationship, that we understand that when you say in that marriage contract in front of each other, in front of the officiant and in front of the witnesses, and you sign on the contract, it's supposed to be a lifetime contract. It's supposed to mean that you are to love, honor, and cherish. You are to, care for this person as if they were you. And that's important. And part of that process is making a decision that no matter how that person treats you, you are not going to treat them the same way. You're going to treat them the way that you want to be treated. And if you don't want to be abused, then don't abuse. If you don't want to be hurt, don't hurt. It's as simple as that, but it's not always that simple, because the simple fact is, as I said, when there are important things to discuss, you're going to come at it from different perspectives because you're different. You're complementing each other. There are certain aspects that God puts together because he sees that there are certain strengths that you have that the other person doesn't have, and they have certain strengths that you don't have that they have. So it's important to understand that you are a unit. Now, I love how one of my friends, a young fella named Steve, I was listening to when he was doing a marriage, and I loved it. He said, the two become one, okay? You're not two people somehow melding together. You've made a decision that you are going to be one unit. Now, if you involve God in that unit, guess what? Your chances of success go up exponentially. In fact, about 80% go up, because you now have the spiritual dynamic in your relationship. Now, when you, of course, are in this conflict situation, let's say, for example, your spouse betrays you. Let's just use that as a simple thing. Now, the reason I used this scenario and also used all this other stuff that I was talking about is that very easily you can become hurt. Now, it's okay to be hurt, but it's not okay to stay hurt. You see, Paul was talking about a progression here. And he said, first of all, he says, you got to get rid of bitterness. Now, the book of Hebrews calls it a root of bitterness, okay? What happens is the seed of offense, the seed of hurt, the seed of betrayal, whatever form it comes, you begin to think about it. And I'm going to give you a little progression of thoughts according to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. It always starts off with a simple thought. Why did they do that? Why did they say that? What did they mean by that? Why would they do this? You have a sense of hurt. You have a sense of betrayal. You have a sense of abuse and trauma. And it all kind of and 9 times out of 10, you don't even see it coming. That's because many of us live in this kind of cocoon type of situation. You have trusted this individual with your special moments. You've let them into your life. This is where the deepest hurt comes from. If somebody you don't know does something, you can usually shove it off. You can say, that's their problem. But not when somebody actually who you've let them into your life. You've allowed them to be a part of you. And then all of a sudden, they do something. Now, I want to make very clear, 9 times out of 10, they don't even know they've done it. But there are those individuals who are manipulative, they are abusive, and they've got some major problems themselves, okay? And often what happens, and this can happen in relationships, you don't see the warning signs. I want to tell you, you need to see the warning signs. If you see them abusive with somebody else, don't think for a single moment that you are, of course, exempt from that, okay? Especially if you enter into a relationship. A perfect place to see a person's personality is in a restaurant and how they deal, let's say, for example, with the waitress or when they get the bill. You can see an awful lot about their personality right then and there. And if you see any warning signs, guess what? They may not be the person that you need to be with. It's very, very important, especially in the dating process. I absolutely guarantee that you're going to see their personality faults. And then you have to make a decision. Are you going to enter into a relationship based upon that? And of course, the other question is, can you speak into their lives and correct a behavior? It can happen. So you have to see those things before it happens. Don't enter into a relationship with someone when you actually see the warning flags, okay? Unless you believe that you can work with that. If you can't work with it, don't enter into a relationship, especially a romantic and also a relationship that's going to lead to marriage. Don't do it. You'll save yourself a million problems. I guarantee it. Anyway, so let's say you are in this relationship and a betrayal happens and you're walking through this whole scenario. You're dealing with these thoughts. Well, if you're not careful, it'll lead to what we call strong thoughts. And when that strong thought begins to take root, you'll begin to go into an area which we call imagination. Now, we're not talking about, seeing stars, and we're talking about reasoning process. You begin to say, why did they do that? And then you begin to analyze why they did it. And in some cases, you may excuse it, and other cases, you can't excuse it. And so it leads into a reasoning process. And I guarantee this is something you need to understand. There'll be something in that conversation that will have some merit of truth. It always has a merit of truth. Now, if you end up with someone who has their own issues and they're dumping on you, you have to decide, okay, they're dumping on me. They've made me the object of what's going on in their heart. And you can ask yourself the question, can I put up with it or can I not put up with it? And one of the things that always happens when you're caught off guard, when you're blindsided, 9 times out of 10, you're blindsided by the thing, you're asking yourself this question: what did I do? How come this is happening? And most of the time, they're verbally, laying it on you, and you're just being boop, 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 boop. And then afterwards, they leave or they wait for some sort of reaction. I've had a situation where this guy was yelling at me and he said, well, what are you going to do? Now, I made a decision and it was the wrong decision. I yelled back at him and it got not so good. Well, he says, well, I was looking for a reaction and I got for it. And I said, you're right, you did. I said, I shouldn't have done it, but I did. And I said, you know what? You got your reaction. Aren't you feeling good about it? And he said, yeah, I am actually. And I said, well, that is very immature. And then he hung up. So the simple fact is that when it does happen, it usually comes in a verbal barrage. I call it the cannon barrage. Boop, 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 boop. And you're sitting there and you're going, what just happened? And then that's when the mental process begins. You say to yourself, I should have said this. I mean, there was 1,000 things you could have done. A zinger, whoa. And you don't prepare. And then what happens to you is that you begin to replay it over and over and over again. And you begin to analyze it and you make it bigger than it is or should be. And instead of forgiving, you begin to allow a root of bitterness to begin to happen. That's the best way of looking. When, for example, an acorn falls on the ground, sooner or later, it is going to take root. And when it takes root, over time, it becomes a tree. And it's the same way with bitterness. It can take root and it can start going into your life. And when it gets into your life, it changes everything. The next thing that happens, according to the Apostle Paul, is it begins to rage within inside of you. It's like a volcano that is slowly percolating. There's this heat that's inside of you, and it's slowly building. You may be able to suppress it. You may be able to put it down for a while. But guess what? It slowly rages inside of you. And it begins to make you make some declarations. For example, you'll say, I am never going to have anything to do with that person again. Or you're going to say, next time there's an opportunity, I am going to let them have it. Or you're going to say to yourself, I'm never going to be hurt like this again. And guess what you're doing? You're hurting yourself. You're hurting yourself. And sooner or later, that inward rage is going to actually become anger. And anger is the emotion and the action that comes out of you because the bitterness has taken root. That inner rage has been working underneath the surface. And the simple fact is you haven't forgiven. You haven't released it. You haven't dispersed it. And so what happens is that thought turns into a strong thought. It turns into an imagination where you justify your action, where you plan out your next move. And then guess what? It becomes a stronghold. And the reason it becomes a stronghold is because it sooner or later corrupts you. And it makes you a person that you were never thought that you would be. I often say this about sin or anger. It will always do something to you that you never thought would happen to you. It will take you places that you never thought you'd be taken to, and it will make you become a person that you never wanted to become. And that's why so you have bitterness, inward rage, and then it slowly expresses itself in anger. That's why James says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. When you are hearing things, and I mean with clarity, with compassion, when you're thinking about the person that you're listening to, okay? You're going to be very slow to speak. You're going to measure what you have to say. Sometimes the best response is no response. You know what lawyers tell you when they're dealing with with police? Police, of course, are looking for evidence and they're looking for something to trap you with. And they're very good at it, okay? And in some cases, they'll even lie to you. So the simple fact is, don't say anything. Invoke the right to silence. Now, I'm not saying that you should be wary of every police officer. Of course not. But the simple fact is, there is a time to open your mouth and there's a time to be quiet. That's what we learned yesterday about the timing of this thing. So basically, when you have this root of bitterness inside of you because of something that someone did or some situation, there's this inward rage, and sooner or later, it becomes anger. And it's amazing that usually you are angry at the smallest thing. It doesn't take much. When you are angry with somebody, when you are feeling mistrust or betrayed, then what happens is simply this. Sooner or later, it boils over. It may boil over on that person, or it may boil over somebody else. Either way, that rage and that anger expresses itself. And then also as well, Paul says this, it leads to things such as brawling, things such as violence, and violence is not a violence is mostly out of this thing. You can literally tear somebody apart, and they don't even know why you are tearing them apart because it's in you. And it's colorized everything that you do. This bitterness, this rage, this anger is tearing you apart inside. You are, distrustful. You think that everybody is after you, that nobody understands you, and it goes on and on. And then what happens is, of course, it not only leads to, some sort of violence, whether it is physical violence or verbal violence or silence. You can all of a sudden give somebody a silent treatment. I remember the story of it was a movie, and the guy said, I got so mad at my wife, I was quiet for about a month. Adrian Rogers tells of a story. He said, I was mad at my wife, so I gave her the silent treatment over the weekend. And the Monday morning, he says, I got up in the morning and she walked up to me. She looked me straight in the face and then she began to tickle me. And he says, because she knew where I was ticklish, she says, I was laughing my head off, and yet I was still angry with her. And he says, we both ended up on the ground wrestling. And he says, we began to giggle. And all of a sudden, he says, I apologized. She said, you're not going to be silent with me anymore. And the simple fact was, she did something that she knew was going to undo the situation. Well, the simple fact is, even the best people can, be caught up in anger. It can happen to the very best of people. Now, the simple fact is, it leads to some sort of altercation. And then it can also lead to what Paul talks about, slander. This is where gossip and slander and, accusation can begin to happen because you start running down that person. You start saying bad things about that person, and you will say it to people that they know and trust. You are trying to destroy their reputation. Why? Because you've allowed that rate of bitterness to take root. It is that inner rage is now being exposed. You're angry. You are now showing action. And then you start slandering them. You start gossiping about them. You begin to put them down. You do everything you can to destroy their reputation. Now, remember one thing, reputation is what people think they know about you. Character is what God and your spouse knows about you. And that's what it leads. And then it leads to the final position, which is malice. You are basically a bitter, hurt person. That is what I call the cactus people. And Paul says, put that away. You say, okay, how do I put it away? Well, fortunately, the answer is found in verse number 31. It says, be kind and compassionate, forgiving one another. So what you do is you make a decision. Here you've been hurt. You've allowed it to take bitterness. You've allowed it to take root. You've allowed that inner turmoil and that inner rage to boil over, and it's turned into anger against people, against yourself. Listen, when you have bitterness, you're hurting yourself too. You are slowly poisoning yourself. You are slowly destroying yourself. And you're destroying people around you. And many times you don't even see it because you can't figure out what's going on. That's where outside help is absolutely essential. I've had many, many times where people will tell me their story and they'll say, I can't figure it out. And I'm sitting there and said, I can tell you exactly what happened. And they say, what is it? And I show it to them and they say, I never saw it that way before. I said, that's right. You haven't seen it that way before because you're too close to the situation. And I have no stake in your life. So I can tell you in the kindness of my heart, and also as well because I have chosen to be compassionate. I empathize with what you're going through. You see, when what happens to you is you lose your kindness and you lose your compassion and you lose your empathy and you lose your love when you take that, allow that root of bitterness to take root. And it's a devastating thing. That's why you need to walk in forgiveness. And that's why Paul said, listen, be kind, be compassionate, and forgive each other. Listen, people ask me, well, I can't forgive. Then I say to them, then you're going to stay in this cycle of bitterness and bubbling below the surface, and that anger and that action of violence, and then ultimately slander, and then it leads to a life of malice. Is that what you want to be the rest of your life? You're not Rambo, and you're not, Rocky, or some of these other, vengeful type situations that you see in the movies. It's not rock situation. It's not an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth situation, because that just leads to more bitterness and more hurt and more, people being, dealt with in the wrong manner is what I'm trying to say. He says, forgive one another. Now, you say, okay, how do I do that? Simple. You make a choice that when that person hurts you, you forgive. You choose. That's a choice. Just like love, after a while, is a choice. I've been together with my girlfriend, my wife, since 1978. Okay? She became my girlfriend in 1978. On January 1st of 1978, I asked her to go with me to be my girlfriend. Now, she knew exactly what I was like, okay? In those first few months, I demonstrated, my personality, and she made a decision. And that decision was that she was going to overlook those, what I would call, shortcomings, because she saw something better in me that I didn't even see myself. She believed in me. Now, I saw this beautiful lady, and I saw that this lady was kind and compassionate and gracious, and she's always been those things. Yeah, she has her faults and failures, of course. But you see, I've always considered myself most fortunate that I was actually blessed to find someone like that. And I want to tell you something. It was God who put us together. My wife tells this story. She says, as soon as she sat down beside me back in Bible college, the Lord said, that's the man you're going to marry. And she said, oh no, not him. But within 3 months, I recognized something very special about this. She was different than any person that I had ever met. I've never met anyone like her. Now, fortunately, I have a couple of daughters that are like her, and I have a couple of sons that are like her, more like her than they are of me. And I'm so grateful for that. I really, really am. I've never met anyone like her. I can't find anybody anywhere like her. That's why I consider her a gift from God. I really do. And what I find so fascinating, and I remember when she came walking down the aisle. My wife is a very beautiful woman, not just, spiritually, physically. She's very beautiful. Even now, she's very beautiful. And I sit there. When she came walking down the aisle, I just couldn't believe that this beautiful creature would actually want to be with me for the rest of her life. I was absolutely spackered by that thing. I really was. And I remember a couple of months ago, we were driving in from where we were to where we were going. And she looked at me, she says, you know what? I love hanging out with you. Now, folks, we've been together since 1978, and she still thinks and enjoys hanging out with me the most. Now, I'm not going to tell you that there wasn't times where she wanted to kill me, and maybe I wanted to kill her. And, not really, but you know what I'm talking about. You know what? We practiced forgiveness. We practiced forgiveness because forgiveness is the only thing that's going to keep you together. When you choose to forgive and you choose to forget, it's very, very important. Now, if you happen to be in a relationship with someone, you're going to have to practice forgiveness a lot because they're going to say and do the wrong thing. They're going to betray you. I'm not going to deny that, okay? But you've made a decision. You say, I am going to forgive. Now, this is not just for your monogamous relationship, it's all relationships. You understand a very important principle, and that principle is that everyone is capable of betrayal. You know that everyone is capable. Doesn't mean they're going to betray you. Don't walk around thinking that everybody's going to betray you. But you just be surprised. Believe the best, but never be surprised by the worst. I've discovered that. Both within the church and outside the church, I have discovered that. So the simple fact is, Paul says, number one, be kind. Number two, be compassionate. Now, these are both qualities of love. And I will remind you that it says in 1 John 4:7-8, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knows God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. As I talked about before, it starts with a root of bitterness. Then it becomes that inner rage. Then it expresses itself in, of course, anger and in some sort of violence, whether it is physical violence or, verbal violence or something along that lines. And then you start to slander on that person and you try to destroy their reputation. You say things about them. And even though you don't want to say, all of a sudden you have this verbal garbage coming out of your mouth. Why? Because there's a root of bitterness in you. And then it leads to a life of malice where you are actually going around and maybe you don't want to hurt people, but you hurt people because you've been hurt. You've been speaking out of your hurt and you want others to feel the same way you are. That's a terrible way to live. It really is. So that's why Paul says, walk in love, be kind, be compassionate. These are two qualities of love. You say, I don't have that in me. You're right, you don't. You have to make a decision that you're going to allow outside love to flow in you. You've got to allow love, whether it's the love of God or the love of someone else, to flow in you. Let their example of love show you the way. And it's amazing what can happen. Then what happens is you choose to forgive. That's very important. And the reason why you choose to forgive has very little with the offender. It has everything to do with you. We are to instantly forgive. And one of the things that Jesus was trying to get across when it came to forgiveness in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, listen, what's going to happen is if you don't forgive, you're not going to have forgiveness from your Father in heaven because there's a barrier between you and him. And his whole approach is forgiveness. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And it says in 1 John 1:9, and I love 1 John 1:9, it is my lifeline. Remember that how to become a millionaire and they throw you a lifeline? Well, that's what God did with me. He gave me a lifeline. And that lifeline is 1 John 1:9. It says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and he's just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It belongs to us. We need to choose, of course, to do this. I never said it was easy, but it is a decision. And you decide, yeah, I'm going to forgive. And never said it was going to be easy. Never said that it was going to be something that was going to be, you need to supernaturally do it. You need to make that decision. And you're doing it because you do not want to be under the bondage of that person. I have met people who have been in bondage to dead people, people who are not even alive anymore, but the hurt that they did that they never forgave. I remember years ago, there's this young man who came into my church and he was dealing with some anger with his dad, but his dad was dead. So, I said to him, why don't you write your dad a letter? He says, what? Right, my dad's dead. I said, it's not for him, it's for you. Tell him what you did. He wrote it down. And as he began to write it down, you know what happened? He began to cry. He released all those emotions. He released the pain and the sorrow. And then at the end, he listed in the letter, Dad, this is what you did. His dad's dead. But he wrote it down for his own benefit. And then at the very bottom, he said, Dad, I forgive you. And then he signed it. Well, when he signed it, the flood of tears came. And he sobbed for about 15 minutes. And I just sat there with him. I put my arm around him. And I didn't say anything for 15 minutes. Well, he was sobbing, just absolutely sobbing. And then all of a sudden, he looked up and he said, I'm free. I said, that's right. You're free. Because who the Son sets free is free indeed. But it was forgiveness that set him free. He got rid of that root of bitterness. He got rid of the inner rage. He got rid of the anger. He got rid of the slander. You should have heard the things he was saying about his dad. I said, your dad's dead. Yeah, but that's how I feel about him. And that's when I said, forgive and write the letter. He did. And he says, it's all gone. That's right. Because what happens is when you forgive, love flows. When you forgive, peace flows. When you forgive, grace flows. When you forgive, kindness flows. When you forgive, mercy flows. With the same measure that you give, it's given back to you. And that's why you do it. You do it for your own calmness. You do it for your own peace so that you can once again love. That's why you forgive. That's why Paul said, he said this, forgive one another. He says, just as Christ has forgave you. With the same measure that you forgive, it is given back to you. I can't stress this enough. So Father, today, I talked about broken relationships. I talked about forgiveness. Lord, you know that there are people who are going to watch this video. And I've explained to them the progression of what happens when we keep hurt inside. We start become bitter. There's a root of bitterness that gets a hold of us. And then it leads to an inner rage, inner anger, and not just with the person, but with ourselves, because we didn't say what we thought we should have said or did what we thought we should have done. You see, when we think things over, hindsight is 20/20. You say to yourself, I should have done this, I should have done that, and you beat yourself up because you feel responsible for what someone else did. You're not responsible for what they did. There may have been a measure of truth with what they said. But Lord, we allowed that root of bitterness to take a hold. And it boils under the surface until it explodes like a volcano. And then all of a sudden, there's mess everywhere. Anger is the response. And then what do? We go into a campaign of slandering. We go into a campaign of ruining them just like they ruined us. We accuse them rightfully or wrongfully about what they did. And it leads into a life of malice where, Lord, we think that everybody is like that person that hurt us. Instead, I'm asking today that we would choose the path of love that we would choose the path of kindness, that we would choose the path of compassion. Most of all, that we would choose the path of forgiveness. Lord, I am so sad about how many people today are walking around this way. It was never your intention to do that. And we know that. And we know who's exploiting it over and over again. It's the enemy. He's exploiting it over and over. And the thing is, we seem to attract those type of people, those very type of people that had hurt us. And we allow them into our lives because of some need of approval. And they continue to rail on us. Lord, I'm always amazed at men or women who will stay in an abusive relationship and will continue to take the abuse over and over until something breaks. And it usually leads to some violent confrontation. And also, as well, it can lead to disastrous consequences. And what's really sad, Lord, is that a lot of it is nothing but selfish ambition and covetousness. And that's really sad. Lord, I'm praying that people today will choose the path of forgiveness. This is not an easy path. It's one, though, that brings total healing and total restoration and freedom. People say to me, well, how come I've got to forgive? Because you do not want to be in bondage any longer. Forgiveness is the path towards freedom. It allows us to release that person into the hands of God. And we say, Lord, they're not mine anymore. I'm not going to allow this thing to imprison me anymore. It is so sad that we've allowed these people power in our lives by not releasing them to you. And it's very sad when we do that. So Lord, I'm praying today that whoever sees this video will make that decision and that they will not allow. And Lord, what's amazing to me is how many older couples are carrying this. I remember, and I will speak about this incident because both people have passed into eternity, and my dad has passed into eternity. They were members of my dad's family. And I remember they had been married for about 50 years, okay? And I was visiting them in the city of Toronto. And each one of them spoke to me privately. And they spoke about all the years. Now, I had always considered them a happy couple. But in that conversation with both of them, I mean, they did it separately. Both of them laid on me a lifetime of unforgiveness between them. They had become like in the Cold War. They had come to détente. But when they were alone with somebody who had no stake in what they were involved in, guess what? They laid it all on me. And I remember that night, laying in bed in that home, I began to pray for them. I began to ask the Lord to somehow mend the fences. These were people who had been carrying this thing for decades. And they had all the appearance of happiness. But the reality of the situation, they weren't happy. They were miserable. And they said that. I said, well, why are you still together? Well, we're old school, is what they said. Well, I was glad that they made the decision that they were going to stick it together, but they never talked to each other. I said, have you talked to him? Have you talked to her about this? No. This is a conversation I'm not going to have. And I thought to myself, they both made that decision. That even though they were unhappy and angry at each other, they didn't do something about it. And Father, that's what I was praying for that night. And I said, how can two people do this? And I remember as I was getting on the train the following day to head out to Vermont, I said to myself as I was sitting on the train, Lord, I don't ever want to be that way. I'm going to make sure that with my spouse, I am going to do what I have to do. Lord, we can have roots of bitterness, and sometimes we don't even know they are there. It's very unnerving when we allow the Holy Spirit to speak into our lives and say, Lord, would you expose any evil way in me? And he says to you, do you remember this incident? Yeah. Do you remember that you haven't forgiven them? I said, yeah, I did forgive them. No, you haven't. Because if it keeps coming up over and over again, you haven't. So I thought, Lord, yeah, I'm going to any wayward way in me. And from time to time, he brings something up and I'm going, I thought I dealt with that. He says, not entirely. So then I say, Lord, I forgive them. I release them. And it's been kind of neat how God has also as well spoken to other people about how they treated me. I had a conversation within the last year where someone had been under this thing for 30 years. I had completely forgotten all about it. And then I got the phone call and I looked at the number and thinking, well, what are they calling me for? So I called them. And then they began to relay about something that had happened decades before. And I said, and they said, would you forgive me for my part of that? I said, I forgave you right after it happened. I said, I haven't even thought about the situation. And I had to be honest, I hadn't even thought about them. It was so long ago, but they were still carrying it. And I said, so they said, you forgive me? I said, of course I forgive you. I never even thought about it. And they said, you didn't? I said, no. I said, when it happened, I forgave you because I knew that you were in cahoots with somebody who was manipulative. I knew that you were being influenced wrongly by this person. And I forgave you. I looked at you as the innocence in this thing. And you could have heard, I did hear the sigh of relief on the other end of the phone. It was absolutely amazing. When you practice forgiveness, you are not bound by things. And Satan cannot manipulate it. Satan cannot exploit it. He can't deceive you in with it. You've released it and you've had peace. And that's why Paul said, forgive even as Christ has forgiven you. We've been forgiven. We've confessed it. We've renounced it. We've said, Lord, I'm not going to do this again. And then we receive his forgiveness. And that's the real issue right there. Receive it. Say, Lord, I receive it. I receive the peace that comes with this. I receive the love that comes with it. I receive the assurance. I receive the mercy and the grace that comes with it because I chose to forgive. I let go of that bitterness. I let go of that bubbling under anger and rage. I let go of the anger. I let go of the slander and the malice and all that goes with it. I just let it go. I don't want it to be a part of my life. I don't want it to be a second of my life. That's what we need to do. And if you haven't done it, do it. See that person in your mind's eye and just say, God, I forgive them. I don't want to be imprisoned by them. I don't want to be imprisoned by this thing. I don't want to be, manipulated. And I don't want to feel bad about this thing anymore. I forgive. It's gone. And folks, if it does come back, just say, I dealt with you. and you are not part of my life. Speak to it. Tell it, you're not part of my life. I am not going to go back into that wallowing pigsty. I was chatting today with my prayer partner, and he was telling me about this particular group of people that were saying, well, don't eat pig. And you know what they did? They showed a pig in the pigsty. Well, why would you want to eat that? That's what unforgiveness is. Unforgiveness is a pig in a pigsty. And I want to tell you something. You don't want to eat that. Now, if you happen to like bacon, well, you have to understand the pig was taken care of and they went inside, not the outside, okay? The simple fact is, don't stay there. I love what Carmen says. He says, when the enemy reminds you about your past, just simply remind him about his future. Think about that for a moment. Think about the fact that you do not want to be living in unforgivenessville. You don't want to be on anger street. You don't want to live with rage. And you certainly don't want to be a part of the rumor mill. There's an old song that says, in every community, there is something that basically is in there, and it's called the rumor mill. Don't you be a part of the rumor mill. Don't you be a part of the slander. Don't you take part in the assassination of someone's character. I remember when I got into my first job, and we would sit around the table, and we had these were a bunch of people that worked in mental health. And every single session, every single call, it turned it into a gossip center. Then finally, I no longer could do that. And I didn't go in for coffee anymore. When the charge said, you got to come in for coffee for the meeting, I would come in. And then as soon as the meeting was over, I left. So one day, one of the gossips said, why aren't you sitting in? I said, do you really want me to know? He said, yeah, oh yeah. I said, I can't stand the gossip. I can't stand the way that you run people down. Well, you know, they didn't have anything to say. And I said, and I know that this conversation that we just had is going to be a conversation in the next situation, unless you choose not to. And then I walked away. And I remember not long afterwards, a young lady came to me and said, can I sit with you? I said, sure, we were sitting there. I said, why are you with me? She says, I heard that you didn't want to be part of the gossip. I said, yeah. She says, I don't want to either. And in a time, we had 4 or 5 of us that would have coffee separately. We would go into the meetings, and then we would sit out until the time was done. And then we'd go home. There was 4 or 5 of us. And we would just sit there and chat and have a great old time. And we weren't involved in the gossip session. You got to choose that. Am I going to stand on the side of the accuser or on the intercessor? Well, I choose the intercessor. It's as simple as that. You don't want to live in the slanderville, and you don't want to be part of the rumorville. So, Father, thank you for the time that we've spent together. And thank you. That is so, it's difficult, Lord, in the days that we live to make these decisions. But I pray that we will, because forgiveness is freedom. And love is patient and kind and compassionate. And it's a perfect way to live. So I pray for that. And I pray that, Lord, today, that we will not allow bitterness and slander and anger and rage and malice be a lifestyle to us. But that we would choose today to instead be compassionate and kind and forgiving, because that's the best way to live. And it's also incredible freedom. I thank you for these things now in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if something that I've said has struck a responsive chord in your heart, I always encourage you to press the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that something that I've said has struck a responsive chord, and it will give you some guidance on how to deal with interpersonal relationships. God bless you. Have yourself a great and godly day.